back to the Video Essay Podcast. I'm your host, Will DeGravio, and on today's show, I sit down with Charlie Shackleton to discuss his piece, Criticism in the Age of TikTok. We also discuss Zia Anger's performance piece, My First Film. Before we get to my interview with Charlie, I have two important pieces of videographic news. This will be another reminder that applications to the Scholarship in Sound and Image Workshop at Middlebury College are due on February 1st. This is an opportunity for film and media scholars to learn the nuts and bolts of videographic criticism. All details are made available on our website. Now, full disclaimer, I was the teaching assistant at the most recent iteration of the workshop, but I honestly cannot recommend the experience enough. Without the workshop, I would not be sitting here on this podcast. A lot of great video essays would not be made. And frankly, I think the whole video essay landscape would be nowhere near where it is today, at least in the academic realm, if it weren't for the Middlebury workshop. So definitely go check it out and consider applying. The second piece of video essay information is something that many of you probably already know, and that is that Sight and Sound magazine has published their annual poll of the best video essays of the year. I was actually lucky enough this year to be asked to co-edit the list along with Ariel Avasar, who is a film scholar at Tel Aviv University, and Grace Lee, who runs the popular YouTube channel What's So Great About That, and is a former guest on this podcast. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the poll now because that will actually be the subject of our next episode. At the end of this month, on the 31st of January, Ariel and Grace will come on the show, and the three of us will discuss what it was like to edit the poll, offer our reactions to the results, and we will also be inviting on a host of contributors to talk about why they selected certain video essays for the poll. So this will be a first for the Video Essay Podcast. We're deviating from our usual interview format, but I think it will be very informative to sort of go through the nuts and bolts of the video essay poll. So be on the lookout for that. One essay that was selected by many folks on this year's poll, including myself, was Charlie's essay, Criticism in the Age of TikTok. So let's transition to our conversation with Charlie.
And yet the samples on TikTok are almost never engaged with critically. Take this pretty great phantom thread lip sync I found.
I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm just waiting around like an idiot for you.
When did this happen? What happened to make you behave like this?
Here, the sample is the central focus of the video, but it's used in the service of tribute, not critique.
We now come to the interview portion of the show where I'm sitting down here with the one and only Charlie Shackleton. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
We're going to dive deep into your work, but first I want to get a little sense of the background, kind of who you are, because there are probably lots of folks who have watched your video essays, maybe follow you on Twitter, have read your writing, but don't really know your origin story. So tell us that and take us to the beginning when you first encountered video essays and talk a little bit about how you got interested in creating videographic work yourself.
Yeah, so when I was about 16, I started a movie blog in the UK that was called Ultra Culture, terrible name. And this is sort of how I got into film in general as a critic. And so for several years, as I was sort of finishing my high school studies between the ages of 16 and then right into my early 20s, I wrote this blog, and it was sort of how I discovered criticism and really discovered my own taste and certainly began to engage with cinema in a much more complex way than I had previously. And the blog was naturally kind of a multimedia exercise. I had some video content on there. It was very kind of GIF and image heavy. This was the early 2010s. It was a different time, the late 2000s, early 2010s. And so even though I wasn't making video essay at that point, I think the stuff I was doing was already leaning slightly in that direction. And then when I started to experiment with making video and film work myself, it naturally started as a sort of extension of that impulse. So the first few films I made were video essays or essay films or whatever you want to call them. I made a feature-length essay film about teen movies called Beyond Clueless, and then I made another one about horror cinema called Fear Itself. And in a way, you know, even as these things branched into different environments and different sort of exhibition contexts, it still felt like that same impulse that I was fulfilling writing the blog or freelancing as a critic or anything else. And even now that I've kind of moved into more traditional documentary work, to me it still feels very much part of the same spectrum.
As you're making this blog, you're 16, you're becoming part of the online internet film culture. Were you watching video essays at that time? Like, what were some of the first video essays that you were watching that sort of got you interested in doing the work yourself?
Yeah, very few, to be honest, or certainly in a way that I would have understood as video essay. The thing that I always think back to is a TV show that I loved when I was a teenager that I wonder if you've ever come across. I certainly don't think it traveled beyond the UK really, but maybe you heard about it while you were here, which is The Adam and Joe Show, which was a late night Channel 4 TV comedy sort of sketch-ish show where two young guys called Adam Buxton and Joe Cornish used to host a half-hour weekly TV show shot in their like student bedroom essentially. And it was kind of like almost like a public access show, almost like a kind of Wayne's World thing. But it included a lot of kind of riffs on popular culture, some of which would be in the form of almost like performed skits or sketches, but others that would just use material from the works and maybe add a commentary or recontextualize it in some way. And I remember the second I saw that, just finding that such a stimulating and like kind of transgressive idea. Like I vividly remember this segment that was probably very brief, but it was in which they talked about it was almost like a list feature where they were doing like top 3 plane crash sequences from movies. And they showed a clip of that film with Jeff Bridges that's called something like Unshakable or Fearless. It's called Fearless. That's what it's called. And it was just this sort of like 45 seconds from the film Fearless with a kind of arch, cynical commentary over the top of it. And I just like hadn't seen anything like that before, which is obviously, you know, the most basic kind of video essay conceit imaginable, but I found it so radical and exciting that certainly was like an early formative thing. And then I think it wasn't until much later, maybe when I first saw Los Angeles Plays Itself, which obviously is a sort of formative one for a lot of video essayists, I think, that I really realized like, oh, this could be art every bit as worthy and as meaningful and as potent as the raw materials that it's working with. Like, you know, I saw that film at the BFI, projected up massive. I mean, it looked like shit. This was the old version before it went all HD, but it was just incredible to suddenly realize like, oh yeah, this can be film just as much as a scripted drama is film.
What was the first video essay that you made?
I remember when I was a teenager, for some reason, like I can't even really remember the thought process behind this, but I made a video that was in which I took every frame of the film. Which film was it? It was Vertigo. Took every frame of Vertigo, and then I used this app I had that sorted images by predominant color. And so it took every frame of the film and then it ordered them in order of hue, essentially, so that I then had, you know, however many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of frames ordered by hue in a folder. And then I dropped them back into a timeline and just made like a film the same length as Vertigo, but that was like completely unwatchable, just like hyper-kinetic cuts between all these different frames, but that did sort of over the course of an hour and a half go from, you know, red to orange to yellow and so on. And like, I couldn't even retrospectively give you any kind of justification for what that was meant to reveal or anything like that, but it was certainly the first time that I had really experimented with, you know, chewing up and spitting out existing material in that way. But that never went online or went anywhere.
Well, if you still have it, you should totally put it up online. I would love to see it.
I wonder if I do. The problem is I probably got it as like a Final Cut 7 project file or something that wouldn't even be openable on any computer known to man.
Right. Well, it just reminds me so much of the deformative work that's being done, like by Jason Mattel and Kevin Ferguson as well. I would love to see it. So you have an audience of at least one if you want to put it. And I'm
I'll
sure
have a look.
Much
I'll try and dig it out.
Yeah. That brings me to my next question, which is that you are also a filmmaker in addition to a video essayist. Do you think that your background as a filmmaker influences your video essay work?
Yeah, it feels completely fluid to me. I mean, if anything, it's more the case that my video essay and critical work is informing my increasingly kind of traditional, quote unquote, filmmaking work. I've always been doing both things at the same time, as much as you can separate the things into two categories. But I've probably done a lot more work over the last couple of years that other people would consider film as opposed to video essay or criticism or whatever else they wanted to call it. And certainly the skill set and the creative approach feels very interchangeable to me. Whether that, much of the work I've made in documentary deals with archive of some kind, whether that's existing popular culture or existing, documentation of a historical story. I've done a lot of work with, or about rather, kind of forgotten narratives from the past, which inevitably require dredging up archival material, which to me feels exactly the same to work with as does, a feature film or clips from television or anything else. And even now, as I start making, much more traditional film work, that part of my brain still feels like it's being very keenly activated.
And one of the credits in your producing background was Standby for Tape Backup. And of course, that's Ross Sutherland's film, which Chloe Galibert-Lenné and I discussed on the last episode of the podcast. So listeners will hopefully have watched that film in full. And if you haven't, shame on you, because it's truly fantastic. And like I said, you are a producer on the film, and you hold the distinction of being the first guest who has produced a video essay or essay film that we've talked about on this show. So my first question is, did you listen to my conversation with Chloe? And no pressure if you haven't. Just be interested to know what you thought. Like, did we get anything wrong? I feel like you should have your say. And also, could you talk a little bit about how you got involved with the project and specifically what your role was?
So yes, I did listen to it, and I loved hearing it. There's nothing better than hearing like intelligent, thoughtful conversation that really taps into work that you send out into the world and hope people will engage with in anything approaching that level of depth. And specifically hearing you and Chloe talk about it in the context of performance and the performance in her work is fascinating, because I know that's been a focus of a lot of her sort of investigation and her own output. And that's so key for Ross, obviously, who is a performer, first and foremost, a performance poet, and who I think brings to video essay, or at least the two films that we've made together that are certainly in the realm or close to video essay, a whole different set of priorities than most people who work within that field. The way the project came about was that there was initially it was a live theatrical performance that Ross delivered with an accompanying video backdrop. And I had known Ross for maybe about a year by then and had seen a couple of iterations of the show. And as I was currently kind of immersing myself in the world of essay film and video essay and seeing so much more work than I'd ever seen before, because I'd just put out my first film that was, getting compared to a lot of these various different video essay and essay film works that I was therefore being introduced to, I couldn't then watch Standby for Tape Backup, the theater show, and not just think, wow, this could be such an incredible like artifact film, like an hour long, almost a kind of purist version of the stage show being this story of one man's relationship with his grandfather told through the medium of a VHS tape. What happens when you essentially put that back into the realm of recorded media? And so I talked to Ross about this, and he was really up for the idea. And he had actually himself already made a really phenomenally good short film / video essay called Every Rendition on a Broken Machine, which is one of the best short films I think I'd ever seen by that point. And I was astounded that he could I think he made it in a weekend with like a tiny bit of funding from some arts grant organization here. And it's like a 20-minute just stream of consciousness, incredible piece of work about poetry and robotics and the collision of the two, that like so much of Ross's work just revealed this incredible, spontaneous, instinctive feel for a medium. In this case, remixing existing video and adding this new commentary, which was also what he was doing in the stage show. And so I suggested to him that we make a film version of Stand By for Take Back Up, and then really only over the course of the next couple of months we put together that, editing it together, producing it together, and him writing, directing, obviously. And then it was suddenly on cinema screens, and that was like a really bizarre, quick, exciting development. It felt so sort of strange to see, once you remove his physical presence from the performance, it becomes, I think, this much more sort of elliptical, kind of creepy at times object. And to see this, weird artifact suddenly blown up to sky-high proportions on cinema screens was very thrilling and encouraging.
I love that. And I love hearing you talk about it, because in so much of your work, I feel your passion and interest in what other people are making. And I feel that specifically in your video essay, Criticism in the Age of TikTok. And so I'd love to transition to that. And I should just add that my asking you about Ross's film, and if you'd listened to the podcast, was not compliment fishing at all. I just so thank you for your kind words. But I imagine that at some point in my conversations with folks, I in particular are going to make some dumb mistake while talking about someone's work. So I just wanted to, he just felt it was fair to give you a shot. So, but let us transition now to talking about your work, which again is Criticism in the Age of TikTok, which you made for Sight and Sound. One of the things I love about the piece is you are sort of taking us on your own personal exploration of the TikTok platform. And it begins with you talking about being at a film festival in Australia where you were invited as a mentor, which you say should be in air quotes. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about just the origin story, how you came up with this idea. Did you pitch the essay to Sight and Sound before the Australia experience, or did that truly inform the essay? Talk a little bit about that.
So the origin story is a fairly prosaic one, in that I had come back from 2 glorious weeks in Melbourne to an email from the Melbourne International Film Festival and the lovely guy there who runs the Critics Campus, reminding me that I needed to send him links to my professional coverage of the festival. I had no idea I was meant to be delivering any professional coverage of the festival. I was also there to mentor these young aspiring critics, and had entirely forgotten that in an email fully 12 months earlier, which I immediately went back and looked at and saw in all bold in the first line of the email was, "You will be expected to deliver coverage in an international outlet." So I briefly panicked and then considered my options. And I kind of thought it's a weird thing providing coverage of a festival, because you're often, it can feel a bit box ticking. And there's certainly a lot of outlets running festival coverage that no one's really reading. And sometimes festivals don't even necessarily mind that much, as long as they are getting coverage in the right places and it builds a profile for the festival and, makes them the kind of festival that gets coverage in that place and so on. So it's a weird, it can feel like a slightly weird echo chamber, that kind of thing. And I didn't want to, especially having already fucked up and missed the work I was supposed to be doing, I didn't want to just review the 3 movies I watched and find somewhere to put them and then not really have that reach anyone. And so instead I landed on the idea of doing something about the thing that had genuinely fascinated me most while at this festival, which of course was nothing to do with the festival, except that my mentees in this scheme were the people who introduced me to it, which was TikTok, which already talking about now in December 2019, I feel like is so old news, but I promise it was slightly fresher in August 2019, because I just found it fascinating that there was this, online universe that was so familiar and so completely relevant to this cast of people that I was spending time with, who were all about 23, and that my friends, who were all about 28, didn't know really anything about. And, that's such a sort of micro generations difference. And yet I thought spoke to this whole different way of understanding the internet, and especially video on the internet. And so I thought I'd do something about TikTok. And because it's a video platform, video essay felt like the natural approach. And so it was only at that point that I pitched it to Sight and Sound. And in fact, my kind of main priority at that point, because of everything I've just said, was getting it online as quickly as possible. Not just, to fulfill an obligation or whatever, but because it felt like saying anything about this incredibly fast-moving, kind of culturally flighty platform needed to be said quick, or it would feel outdated. I would be the guy talking about last week's memes. And so I sent an email to Sight and Sound and said, like, look, I'm going to make this either way, but if you want to have a look at it and run it, go ahead. And then I figured if not, I would just put it out through my own channels.
One of the things I was thinking about as I was watching it, and you identify a not generational divide, but it's funny how things on the internet, when they come up fresh, can miss people by just a couple years. And one of the things I was thinking about was it could be very easy to make a video essay about TikTok from the perspective that you're coming from, which is I'm 28 and I don't really understand what these 23-year-olds are doing. That could come off as condescending. And your video essay is not in any way condescending, but I'm wondering if that was something you thought about as you were doing the voiceover. And specifically, I'm wondering if you sent the video essay to anyone who you met at the festival who is a TikTok user to get feedback or kind of see what they thought about it. I'm just kind of curious to hear about how you are working yourself through the material, essentially.
Yeah, no, I didn't send it to any of them. I had been sending them my own TikToks, sort of leaning into my role as like older brother of the group. So yeah, they were very aware of my continued fascination with the app, certainly. And I think in terms of like not being condescending, obviously, yeah, not for me to say, but I think the thing that felt important to me was to make a sincere effort to understand before I said anything about it. And even now, I feel like I understand a lot more than I did then. And, certain aspects of the video feel a bit naive to me now. But also acknowledging the gaps in my knowledge and my status as someone slightly outside of the kind of core demographic of this app. And I think especially because, the sort of default grumpy old man response to it would be to just call it shallow or dangerous at the other end of the spectrum. Having any kind of sincere attempt to engage, I think, slightly offsets the possibility of it feeling condescending, even though obviously I have and I offer in the video criticisms of TikTok without even getting into the myriad well-worthy criticisms of the TikTok corporation and its various political and moral decisions, which at a certain point I decided needed to be saved for some other video essay because they could hardly be contained within something that was, primarily about the potential of the app as a home for criticism, having a sort of 5-second aside, which I did at one point have, where I sort of went like, oh, and obviously this is all very problematic, just felt unearned.
Your essay borrows or shares a lot of similarities to the desktop documentary, perhaps most notably the essay. For those who have not watched it, and you should, so you should go to thevideoessay.com and watch it. It is the iPhone interface that is sort of the texture of the essay. And I was thinking about, Chloe's watching The Pain of Others, or Chloe and Kevin's reading Binging Benning. And they're similar in that they use the desktop and the phone background and sort of the natural world of the media object that they're exploring, whether it's YouTube in the case of Chloe or TikTok in your case. But the difference that I felt was I didn't feel like you were exploring, if that makes sense. Like in Watch the Pain of Others, Chloe kind of sets out to find something about her own reaction, and it's about spectatorship, whereas your essay kind of felt very much like, I want to show you this thing that's been like bothering me and that I've been thinking about, and let me walk you through it. And I'm wondering, first, do you agree with me? And second, how is this something that you deliberately thought about, and how did the use of the iPhone interface shape the tone, the style, and the overall creation of the piece? I know I've just crammed like 3 questions in there, but if you want to take a shot at one or all 3, please.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so no, I think that's a very astute distinction between this piece and something like Chloe's Watching the Pain of Others, is that Chloe, and this was so much of what you two talked about with regards to performance, she is sort of performing the present tense. That essay takes place in the present. You see her process and her, the evolution of her ideas almost in kind of real time, even though there's obviously a massive layer of artifice in creating that illusion of the present tense. There is obviously similar levels of artifice and performance in mine, but I would say to a different end. There it is sort of a past tense telling. I'm recounting for you the last few weeks of my thinking, essentially, which I think is a mode that comes more naturally to me, and certainly is something that a lot of my documentary work has in common with my video essay work, is it's about storytelling and it's about how people frame stories. And so to me, it felt natural to do it in the form that I would tell it to you in the pub. If you were like, what did you get up to in Melbourne? And I would say, oh yeah, it was great. I had all these lovely meals and I learned about this thing called TikTok. Let me tell you about it. In terms of the visual form of it, I had an issue. I kind of knew I wanted it to be vertical because it felt natural that it should match the actual TikTok video content. But at first I went about this in entirely the wrong way, attempting to sort of, create this quite pristine, dynamic video essay that just happened to be in a vertical format. So it was all these quite sort of precious little visual setups and, posters framed on a pretty green background or whatever. And that just felt so sort of spiritually wrong for the thing that I was talking about, which is this app that's actually really kind of visually messy. Like there's lots of like text on text and like images constantly popping up, and it's frenetic and kind of visually exhausting, as was, the kind of story I wanted to tell. Like I wanted to convey that feeling of like when you're really excited to tell someone something and you can't kind of get it out quickly enough, and you're like, yeah, and that's amazing because it also makes me think of this thing. And then, I was reminded of X and Y and Z, and all of that, as I started down the road of making the video essays, seemed to kind of congeal together into this form that it ultimately took, which was not only something that's verbally kind of freewheeling, but also visually freewheeling in the way that you literally are when you use your phone and you have to flip between screens, and maybe you want to show someone a video that you have saved in your VLC app, but then you also want to show them like a funny thing you saw on Twitter, so you're flipping between, and it becomes this sort of live demonstration, which borrows a lot of what I like about desktop documentary work, which is that you're being welcomed into a naturally intimate space, people's personal computers, even though they're sort of aesthetically sterile on the surface. There are also these very personal spaces, and it feels even more personal to be inside someone's phone and to, potentially see their messages and their, saved photographs and all this sort of stuff. Not to even mention the fact that I also got to literally direct the action with my fingers. So, this is a video essay directed down to the millimeter by my fingers, which is an incredible kind of directorial power to have over the image. So yeah, it did come about naturally in the end, but was that process of kind of working out what I can do with the form that will feel unique to the form and also appropriate to the subject. Because that's the other thing, like TikTok, one of the things I find most stimulating about it is that the users of TikTok, or at least those who I think are making the most interesting content, refuse to be constrained by the limits of the app itself. So they're taking their videos and putting them in another app to get like an effect that they can't get in TikTok natively. Then they're loading them back into TikTok. Then they're like grabbing a bit of audio from, their GarageBand app and putting it in here. And, it's all pretty guerrilla, despite the very kind of clean cut, interface of the app itself. And so getting to exploit a similar kind of constraint for creative ends to sort of say, okay, what can I actually do on my phone? If I want to talk about Godard can I have a Godard film in the VLC app and show the clip there rather than just cutting to it? If I want to talk about, a tweet that was taken down, can I show the literal folder in my Google Drive where I have the tweets saved from when I, made my like legal claim to have it reinstated? And you're telling whole other layers of the story just through those actions that are not, being conveyed in words. They're being conveyed in the architecture and the infrastructure of the phone itself.
One thing that what you just saw, people watching it on their phone, I think I was Jake Swinney that I was talking to about this, was that he's just started publishing a lot of his work just straight to Twitter. And I think you did the same thing. Was that just because, is that where you're finding the most views? I mean, it also, most people are on Twitter on their phone, so your video essay works perfectly there. But is that something you see yourself doing more of in the future?
Yeah, I love it. Like, I genuinely think it's the best platform currently going for video essay. And I mean that both in the sense of just hosting a video essay within the native Twitter video infrastructure, which I just think is such a like fluid way to get it into the flow of, like what I find interesting about video essay in all of its myriad forms is that it's just this sort of thing that flows into the daily ebb and flow of your life. And it's usually about, how we interact with media. So welcoming it into your day in the most organic way possible is ideal. I don't really want people to like set aside 10 minutes to sit down and like in perfect conditions watch my video essay and with their headphones on and full screen or whatever, because that as an experience is so boxed in and so sort of isolated. I'm much more interested in someone watching my video essay on their commute or, while they're skiving off work and shouldn't really be on Twitter at all, but suddenly they've clicked a video and it's 7 minutes long, and before they know it, they've watched the whole thing. Like, that's how I think you're actually really engaging with the way that people consume media. Twitter video does have all manner of annoyances, which make this less than ideal. Obviously, the resolution is not wonderful, so if you had anything that's super detailed, you're probably going to get lost. It also inexplicably still has the bug it's had for literal years at this point, where any video you upload to Twitter, the audio becomes offset by 100 milliseconds, which is infuriating, because especially with a video like this where like it's containing a lot of TikTok videos that are set to music, all the timing just goes completely off. So you literally now have, what I now do with video with video that I put on Twitter is create a version that has 100 millisecond offset in order that it then gets set back by Twitter to where it should be, which is insane for one of the biggest websites on earth that they haven't solved this problem. But yeah, and then even looking beyond that, like, to be honest, I was saying this, in fact, to Chloe recently. I genuinely think one of the most interesting sort of, to me, and stimulating ways to get out video essays these days, whether you want to call this a video essay or not, is in the form of a Twitter thread. Like, I've done a number of Twitter threads, which is a terrible sentence to say. I apologize in advance. But Twitter threads that, to my mind, are essentially video essays. And in the absence of a platform like Twitter, I probably would have made as video essays. But maybe only, a third of the content of the essay is video. And then the rest of the thread is maybe audio or images or links to elsewhere or text. And I just find that such a kind of fluid way to tell a story like that and convey it to people in a way that is accessible and, at the very center of their daily experience. I find, like, limitlessly fascinating.
Let's transition to a discussion of my first film. And I'm going to lean heavily on you here to describe the piece.
Sure. So my first film, which is in quotes, as opposed to Charlie's first film, is a performance, essentially, by a filmmaker called Zia Anger, that she performed several times throughout 2019, I think maybe 2-3 dozen times at various festivals and cinemas across North America primarily, but I saw it in Sheffield at Sheffield Documentary Festival in June. And it's a desktop documentary, like many of those that we've discussed already in this conversation and on previous episodes of your podcast. And I think that's probably the reason, although we can talk about this later on, that to me, this is video essay, or at least deals with all the same sort of preoccupations that I think video essay at its best does. But you could also call it a performance lecture, various other sort of confines it fits into. What it is Zia Anger for an hour basically telling you the story of her failed first feature film and telling you this story through the medium of her desktop. So as we were saying earlier, you're invited into this kind of intimate space of her personal computer. She is sitting physically among the audience with her laptop on her lap, performing for you this hour-long kind of performance spectacle in which she never speaks. The way she tells the story of this failed filmmaking experience was she types her narration into a word or like a text edit document. And so you're constantly presented with this weird sort of push and pull where it's intimate, both kind of figuratively because of the associations of a personal computer, and literally because she's right there with you in the room, but also kind of sterile. You never actually hear her voice. You just see the text. And we know obviously that this isn't the first time she's performed this, and that a lot of this, if not all of this, is pre-written text. And she essentially guides you in this very kind of transparent, quite radically open way through this experience, the sort of emotions and practicalities and economics of independent filmmaking in the 21st century, and of film failure, which is a subject that is so rarely talked about, but one that is almost universally relatable to any independent filmmaker. I think I've been very lucky to have my work be seen and discussed and exhibited in various contexts, but the behind the scenes process of festival rejections and funding applications and everything else is just an aspect that often gets left behind once, you have something successful that you obviously are more keen to talk about. And so, what you're left with is this just really powerful, strange, intimate hour of looking at someone's computer desktop on the screen in front of you while they kind of bare their soul from, the row across from you.
And I should just, full disclaimer, I have not seen Zia Anger's film. I am relying on the trailer and various articles that Charlie has sent me. So all those too will be available on the website. So take everything I was saying with a grain of salt. But one of the things that reading about this piece got me thinking about was a phrase that Katie Grant often uses, which is working in the flow. And it seems to me that this piece is the perfect example of that, because the way in which Katie uses it is that as you're creating a video essay or essay film online, you're making different variations of it. Sometimes you will put it up online, you'll get feedback, you'll take it down. This is perhaps best captured by the fact that Vimeo allows you to update video files without losing, the URL or the comments or anything like that. So technically you could put in a video that was published in a journal like In Transition and then change it, a year later. The ethical implications of that are probably not so great, but you could do it. But it's all part of this idea that videographic work sort of allows for this constant revision. And it seems to me that this is sort of captured in the live performance aspect, because I assume each performance is somewhat different, right? Like there's probably perfecting it, and there's probably drawing this line between not making it feel too rehearsed and scripted and making it feel more natural, which is something that is so essential to the desktop documentary genre. And so am I right in what I'm saying? Like, did you feel that as an audience member? Like, does it feel super rehearsed, natural? Take us inside, the theater as you watched it.
Yeah, and I mean, first off, I think you're totally right. Like, this is a very extreme example, but that is completely becoming the norm. This sort of, art by revision. It's like Kanye West putting out successive versions of his album across the week that it comes out. Or in fact, I literally just today read that Universal are now shipping new DCPs of Cats to cinemas around the world with updated effects, because the effects in the original version that went out on Friday are so ropey. So this is, clearly like a very an idea that is only going to become more widespread. And I think, this is exactly the reason that I was... Well, so first, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I only saw the performance once. I have no way of knowing how much it evolved, how much was improvised, if any. I have been tricked many, many, many times in theatrical contexts into thinking I've seen something spontaneous or improvised that I then find out happens at every single performance. So my inclination is always to assume that things are much more tightly scripted than they seem. But certainly the creative impression is one of spontaneity. And there is room, and indeed at the performance I was at, there was a responsiveness to what was happening around the room, as well as aspects of the performance that build in by necessity spontaneity. One of the really fun kind of ways that she sort of sets the tone in the room and prepares people for the terms of the performance is that when you go in, there's text on the screen that says turn on the change if you have an Apple device. And we could talk later about what it says about the demographics of the kind of people who are going to see this experience, that almost everyone has a fucking Apple device in the audience. Turn on your AirDrop and allow yourself to be sent things by anyone. And then she, on the screen before you, starts dragging all of her deleted Snapchat videos onto just random phones in her AirDrop panel. So suddenly all around you, everyone is being sent these videos of Zia Anger, and you're watching them, and suddenly this becomes like a participatory experience. So you're instantly thrown into this much more kind of anything can happen, spontaneous, but also ephemeral mind space. And I think inevitably that must be something that she is refining with each iteration, because why would you not? It's like any theater, I suppose, or certainly any kind of performative art. And it reminds me a lot of the way that Ross developed Standby for Tape Backup, which was exactly that same process. Seeing which bits worked, seeing which bits didn't, changing, the ways that the videos looped in response to the way that the audience was reacting to his performance. The difference here is that, I cajoled Ross into ultimately creating a kind of sealed in acetate version of that performance once it was retired from the stage. Whereas this, now that it's slightly unclear, but possibly been retired as a performance, now will just cease to exist at all. And that in itself, I think, is so fascinating, especially given that the subject of the work is a film that, as she says in the performance, doesn't really exist if it's never been seen by anyone. She made her first film, it wasn't accepted into any festivals, and although she has reworked its raw materials into this performance, that first film can still not be accessed by anyone. And therefore, does it exist? That is one of the questions she offers in the performance. And I think you could ask a similar question about my first film, this performance, in that, it exists for as long as you're watching it. And it exists now only in memory, which is why, although you haven't seen it, I was sort of intrigued to have this discussion, because I think in some ways the way that you feel about it and your perspective on it, having not seen it, is just as interesting as mine having seen it.
The AirDrop portion of the performance is so fascinating, because it almost seems like a deconstruction of the theater going experience, right? It's the opposite of please silence your cell phone. Please turn your AirDrop on. Final question here. And I know that this piece was only released this summer. How has it influenced you? And I don't mean I took this from this video essay, but the way you think about your own work, has it inspired you to try something similar? Like, I'm just want to hear just kind of a more, you've already mentioned it, but a more personal side about how the piece has affected you, because I think it is an interesting choice, and I would think it could be a good way to end our conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And this may now be a frustrating answer, because the truth is that yes, there's two projects in particular that I am currently working on that this has become like a very big influence on, and a cause for reflection while working on, but I don't really want to talk about them before they're done. So I'll have to just really annoyingly leave that hanging. But in a more general sense, it's certainly been one of the most striking things I've seen this year from the perspective of exploiting form to facilitate function. Because I think what she does with the confines of a personal computer feels so right, despite feeling it kind of in the abstract, not necessarily a perfect fit. She's talking about a kind of scripted drama film that she made, and yet we're not consuming it in the sort of purest cinematic confines that we normally consume that kind of work. Instead, we're seeing it, boxed in on a VLC window next to a text edit document. And as sort of wrong as that might feel on paper, it just reveals all of the underlying themes that the work is about, which is the sort of blunt, practical reality behind the, quote unquote, magic of cinema, and the kind of frustration and failure that runs alongside trying to have any kind of career in that world. So yeah, that is certainly food for thought for me, is, how we make form follow function in that way.
Well, on that note, we will leave our audience eagerly waiting the release of your next 2 projects. Charlie, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed talking.
Thank you so much again to Charlie for agreeing to be on the program. Charlie, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to me. It was a really fantastic conversation. Please also be sure to follow us on Twitter at Video Essay Pod, like us on Facebook at the Video Essay Podcast, and subscribe to us on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and peace out.